No. All right, so Chapter 8, contract law. It's the sexiest kind of law there is. Actually, contracts are interesting because they can feel, the concept can feel boring, but I believe good contract law is really one of the most important things to maintain freedom in a country. The idea that I can make a deal with you and have trust and a belief that that deal will be honored is tremendously important to free enterprise, to and to just having a country that operates and runs, right? Anybody ever tried to purchase property in Mexico? No? Okay. So first of all, they have some rules about non-citizens owning property. You have to create some sort of either a citizen type trust or something like that. And so that's challenging. And then there's also rules, just, the contract law is not bad or anything, but it's just the rules are a little different. And so it's scary to buy property in a place when you're not sure, will I really even maintain ownership of that property? You don't know the laws there. So there's their learning objectives. Again, I won't read them to you. You guys are grown-ups and can read learning objectives. But we'll move on to the purpose of contract law. So this is straight out of your textbook. I stole this. And I'm just going to read it to you because even though I just said you're grown-ups and can read, well, I want to emphasize this point. All right, so number one purpose is to maintain incentives for individuals to exchange goods and services efficiently. The other reason I'm going to read it to you is so I can explain it to you because I used big words. And I was like, why would you do that? This book is for students. Why say the purpose of contract law is to maintain incentives for individuals to exchange goods and services efficiently? Thanks. Does it make sense? Okay, what's it mean?
Means that having contracts is a reason for individuals to exchange goods
Efficiently?
Yeah.
That was a pretty good definition you came up with there. Okay. So think about it. At some point, maybe we had a barter system, right? Back to our original community where Maddie was stealing people's cabbages, right? Probably what we did in that community is at some point we would trade. I grow a bunch of cabbage and you raise cows. I'll trade you some cabbage for some beef or whatever so that we can have a more varied diet. And then as that continued on, we probably developed a currency. That way you didn't have to always have the commodity there to trade it because that's a hassle depending on what commodity is. Some commodities are big and difficult to carry around. So instead, in essence, I will trade you some cabbages in exchange for some either paper or some other item that represents a certain value, and then I can use enough of those to purchase a cow, right? And then someone said, it'd be even better is if I never even had to take possession of the cabbages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to agree to give you a certain amount of money for cabbages to be delivered to this place. Well, we just made a contract. And if I can't be secure in that contract, knowing that it's going to happen, and that if it doesn't happen, I have some remedy, then I'm never going to make that deal. And that's where the word efficiently comes in, the ability to transact this business in the best possible way for all the parties involved. Number two, it reduces the cost of economic transactions because the contract's very existence means that the parties need not go to the trouble of negotiating a variety of rules, not the contract's existence, but contract law's existence means we don't have to negotiate all the rules and terms. In other words, because we have contract law, certain things are already known. We know that if you don't pay up on your contract, then I can force you to at law. So we don't have to agree to that each time. Now we can just agree to, here's what I'm going to do, here's what you're going to do, and that's it. Okay, so it moves the process forward. Three is it alerts the parties to troubles that have arisen in the past, making it easier to plan the transactions more intelligently and avoid potential pitfalls. Right? If we know from past transactions that making a contract with a child isn't going to be upheld by the courts, then I will just avoid making contracts with children, right? So that's why we have contract law. Yeah, well, the rules are different with moms. they can enforce contracts with children, even if the law won't. So this was straight out of the book too. A contract equals a legally enforceable promise. We make promises all the time. Hopefully we try to keep them. But a contract is a promise that has the force of law behind it. Okay. So contract law comes from a couple different places. The first is the common law or case law. You know, by the 1700s, throughout England, judges had made thousands and thousands of rulings on contract disputes. Right? You think about it, that's probably what most court is someone says, you promised to do this, I didn't promise that, I promised this, right? And the judge has to work it out. So all of those things became this kind of body of law that contract law was based on. But what happened is it became too huge. Before they had computers, now we could take every ruling ever, right, and put it online, and then write a program that will just make it a searchable database. We could just keyword search it or whatever. But before that, this group, the American Law Institute, ALI, they spent almost 10 years, 9 years, writing what's called the Restatement of Contracts. What they did, this is American, is they went to all of the court rulings on contracts in the United States, starting with the biggest ones, the ones that had gone to the Supreme Court, then working down to the ones that had been settled in the appellate courts, and they wrote this sort of legal guideline based on all the rulings that were out there. And this thing does not have the force of law because it's not a statute or something that somebody passed, but it is referred to and taught in all the law schools. So every judge that we have today has grown up as a judge or as a lawyer using the Restatement of Contracts. It was rewritten again in It was rewritten again. They spent more than that. So from 1964 to 79, 15 years. And this restatement second of contracts has now become kind of the de facto rule for how judges are going to rule. The only thing that would change that is if the Supreme Court sort of put out some sort of a ruling that was like radically different than this. But guess what? Even the Supreme Court justices, all of them that we have today, were using this Restatement of Contracts in their rulings as lower court judges. So it's definitely impacted their way of thinking. So that's where the case law side of it comes from. There's also statutory law that relates to contracts, and this one's called the Uniform Commercial Code. So again, this ALI, American Law Institute, and another group called the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, they worked for about 10 years to develop what's called the Uniform Commercial Code. So remember, each state passes its own laws. And it was a mess in the early 1900s. Like every state was radically different. So it was hard to know what you could do, which made commerce between the states challenging. I think, it doesn't say it in the book, but I think at some point there was probably a threat of Congress coming in and saying, like, look, if we can't get all this worked out under the Commerce Clause, we're going to start passing some federal laws that are going to, and I think the states start to say, rather than have the federal government limit what we can or can't do, why don't we agree on some terms? So this group wrote up this, I'll call it model legislation, and then a bunch of states, I want to say 49 states have adopted the Uniform Commercial Code. Again, that's not in the book. That's from somewhere I learned before. Louisiana being the only one who hasn't. But theirs is quite similar. They just have some things different. Louisiana's law codes are very interesting because the rest of the states in the Union, our codes are based on English common law. That's how we kind of start with that thought of all the precedents that had existed from the English courts, and then from there they wrote statutes. Louisiana is based on Napoleonic codes, the French laws, because it was all French people running that state still a lot of people of French descent. Okay, so that makes it, I mean, I guess that's not testable, but it's an interesting tidbit. Another statute, which isn't really a statute, but it's called the Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods. See, what happened is that this never got to treaty level. So instead, it's just an agreement between nations, but it was not a formal treaty. We learned earlier that treaties passed and ratified by Congress have the force of statute law. But this one was never passed as a treaty. It's more like, I forget what they call it, like an accord, which usually an accord turns into a formal treaty if enough people sign on to it. Well, we've agreed to it as an accord, and so it does impact American businesses, and this just kind of spells out how you do business with foreign countries. So this is where our current contract law comes from. And this restatement of contracts is probably the biggest source, and the UCC, those two things. All right, so this is kind of to give you an idea of how a contract is formed. In the state of Arizona, and pretty much all states in the United States, contracts need not be written. They can be oral. So if I agree to something, and you agree back, we have a contract. The challenge with oral contracts is that it's easy to say, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean that when I said it, right? Whereas a written contract is much more spelled out, okay? So in order to have a contract, you've got to start with an offer. I'm going to do something. Then I have to have acceptance of that offer. The other person says, okay, I accept your offer for consideration. Consideration means something of value. So if I say, will you clean my yard? And the other person says, yes, we have no contract because no consideration has been offered there. I made an offer, clean my yard. Not much of an offer. They gave an acceptance, yes, I will, but because I offered no consideration, they could walk away from it. If I say, I will pay you $20 to clean my yard, and they say, yes, I will do that, now we have a contract. We have an offer, an acceptance, and consideration, some payment offered, something of value offered. As you can imagine, a lot of court cases hinge on, was the consideration sufficient or reasonable, right? If I make a deal with you to clean my yard for $1, and then you show up and you see that my yard is massive and really dirty, did I offer sufficient consideration for any prudent, normal person to think that that was reasonable? Probably not, right? So there's challenges there. So if you don't have an offer, acceptance, and consideration, you don't have a contract. If you do have a contract, then there are potential defenses to the contract, such as, did I get you to agree to doing the contract with undue influence? I'm your teacher. I control your grade. You want a really good grade, so you agree to clean my yard for $1. Later, you try to back out, and I say, you made a contract with me. You could defend and say, you used undue influence. You used some additional something to get me to do it. Maybe there's misrepresentation, fraud, or duress, which is similar. Duress is similar to undue influence, but usually there's some threat of violence or harm that comes to you. That's what duress means, right? You could get people to agree to things that they wouldn't normally agree to by putting them under duress, or by misrepresenting something. Like maybe I make it sound like this is mine to sell to you, but it really wasn't, right? Capacity. You can't make a contract with somebody who lacks the capacity to make the contract, such as a child, or such as somebody with, say, severe or mental impairment. They can't agree to do something and then be held to it. And then illegality is another defense. Illegality means we can't contract to do something illegal. So if you agree to sell me drugs and I agree to pay you so much for those drugs, and then you back out, I can't really sue you for that. I can't really hold you to that contract. Okay? No, there have been people who have hired hit like a hitman to kill somebody. When the hitman backed out, they tried to sue him. Yeah, and it's like, clearly that's, so if there's any of these defenses, then the contract is what we can call void or voidable, and we'll talk about what those terms mean in a minute. And if there's no defenses, then there's only one more question, which is a written contract required? The Uniform Commercial Code spells out certain contracts that cannot be oral. Those would be contracts for exchange of real property. So if you're buying land, there has to be a written deed with it. Most states require that. Or like an automobile. Automobiles you have to do a title to. So for some contracts, there really is a requirement that there be a written contract. But it's a relatively small number of things, and it's usually the big ticket items. And so if there's no defense, no writing required, then you got a valid contract, and you could take them to court. Yeah.
So could I just write a contract between me and another person? It's just something I want to do. Like I teach guitar, for example, and I need some of my students, they don't just randomly cancel. I mean, that's getting annoying. So I want to like have them pay me even if they don't come to a lesson. Could I write a contract for them to have to do that?
Yeah.
And I can just write it up and have them sign it.
Now, good luck executing it. In other words, if they don't show up and then they don't pay you, then you'd have to take them to court, and which would end up costing you more than the amount they owe you. Yeah. But a lot of people there's a lot of people who, because honestly, if they make a verbal contract, it's binding, but a lot of people don't feel like they have to stand by their verbal agreements. And a lot of people just writing it down makes them more likely to do it. So yeah, you could do that. Probably should do that, actually. All right, so the rest of this chapter is about, they call it the taxonomy of contracts. Do anybody remember learning about taxonomy like in biology class? Remember, taxonomy is how things are named. What is it? Kingdom, genus, species, order? I forget. I've forgotten it since I was in that grade. Yeah, right. That's the taxonomy of biological living things. Yes, right. So this is how contracts are sort of described. So there's several concepts, and I'll go through each of them. The first is what's called explicitness. How explicit is the contract? And this doesn't mean like it's rated E for everybody or A for adult. It's not that kind of explicit. Explicit means the degree to which the agreement manifests to those not party to it. That's straight out of the textbook. What that really means is how clearly are the terms of the contract written. Okay? So there's three types here. The first is called an express contract. This is where the terms of the contract are spelled out directly and clearly. That's what we usually would think of, right? That we sign a contract, has all these terms and conditions, and we agree to them. Then there's an implied contract, and the legal term is implied in fact. This is a contract that is inferred from the actions of the parties. A good example of an implied contract would be if you go to a restaurant and you order some food, no one ever said to you, in exchange for the food that I bring to you, you will pay me this amount of money. Instead, you looked at the menu, you saw how much it cost, or maybe you didn't look at how much it cost, you ordered it, and you implied in the process of ordering that you would pay money for that food. So it's implied in fact, or implied by your actions. Does that make sense? Could you imagine if that didn't exist? Well, I guess they'd just get payment for you up front, right? I mean, you would go in, you'd order the food, they'd say it's this much, you'd pay, and then but even then, what if they said, oh, I'm not bringing the food? So instead, you'd have to have like a written document that says, I agree to pay this much money, and the restaurant agrees to bring food in a timely manner. Like, you'd have to spell out all these terms. So this is a contract that arises based on the actions, and honestly, it's for convenience and reasonableness sake that these things exist. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of written on the bottom of most receipts? Like, I agree to pay this much because
That's different, but yes. So there, what you're saying, in essence, what you're saying is, if the credit card company for some reason or your debit card bounces, then you still agree to make it right. That's what you're saying. Same thing when you write a check, right? There's not a paper that says, I agree by writing this check, although there actually is that you sign with the bank, right? That says when you write checks, you are backing that account, even if it were to run empty, that you're going to fix that. So implied contracts I think they're super important to the way our society runs. Without them, it would really be a very different place with, you'd have to sign and agree that by eating this food, I agree to, I don't know, whatever. So the third is what's called a quasi-contract, or an implied in law contract. And this is where the law actually will impose a sort of contractual agreement even when the parties haven't actually agreed. Let me think of an example of a quasi-contract. There's one in the book too that I'm just drawing a blank on. So in essence, I think, okay, so the one in the book would be something like this. Let's say your neighbor is working on his house, you're working on your house, and the neighbor, is that the one in the book? The neighbor orders some lumber from the hardware store. And the hardware, and he pays for it with his credit card over the phone or whatever. Hardware store pulls up accidentally at your house and delivers the lumber to you. And you're like, sweet, right? Free lumber. And you use it. You really can't, you never agreed to that lumber. But by taking it and using it, you're getting the value from it. It's really, you need to pay for it. Okay? So that's the idea behind that. You can't say, well, it was just a gift from my neighbor, so I don't have to pay it. Because when the neighbor finds out you have his lumber that he paid for, he's going to be upset. And if he takes you to court, the court's going to say, if you use the lumber, you need to pay for the lumber. Even though you never actually agreed with your neighbor or your neighbor never agreed with you. So this is where a quasi-contract comes from. It comes from a whole bunch of case law, right? Where somebody sued somebody for taking advantage in some way, and the court came back and said, we're going to use some sort of regular prudent man sort of principle and say, would a normal person in this situation really believe that that was just free lumber to them? No, you would actually understand that that lumber had a cost and that somebody paid for it and that you should pay for it. So that's what a quasi-contract. So that's explicitness. 3 types of explicitness: express, implied, and quasi. Mutuality. In other words, who made the promise to whom? So there's what's called a bilateral contract, where promises are made by both parties. That's usually an express situation, right, where we both state what we are going to do to make this contract fulfilled. And then there's a unilateral contract, where a promise is made by one party. So it might be this: I will pay you $20 to mow my lawn. The other person doesn't say, yes, I will mow your lawn. They just show up with their lawnmower and mow the lawn. So their answer to the contract is performance. I could see the person saying, I offer $20, saying, you never agreed to it, so I don't have to pay you. No. That's called a unilateral contract. You made a promise, and I can hold you to it. So if you say, I'll pay you $20 to mow my lawn, and I show up and mow your lawn, I can legally hold you to paying me the $20. What's tough about that is, what if I show up a year later and mow your lawn? Well, most states have a statute of limitations wherein the contract expires. But, you know, I guess if we were having to be really careful, if we were dealing with a person who did things like that, we would have to say, you know, I will pay you $20 if you will mow my lawn between this date and this date. But again, for most of us, that arrangement's reasonable. You know, most of this contract law wouldn't be needed if people would just be reasonable, right? Like, just be cool and do the thing you said you were going to do. But there are times when it becomes sticky and difficult, where both parties honestly feel like they're being honest and like fair and true to the contract, and the other one still feels aggrieved. That's where I think the law really is important. But when somebody's trying to take advantage, or, you know, usually the law gets that right and says, you're being dumb. Just do your job, right? They don't say, I would like it if a judge would say that. You're being dumb, yo.
In unilateral contract, most of the time, like between brothers or something.
Again,
Not something you would
with
bring
the
to court.
contracts within the family are a whole nother thing. All right, but yeah.
Like, a lot of the time people will be like, look, I'll give you this if you do this for me. And maybe they hadn't completely thought it through. Like, say, you said, I'll give you $20 to mow my lawn.
Because big brother is taking advantage of little brother, usually. Yeah.
Job or something, but then they show up and mow your lawn as fast as you can so that you can't back out of it.
Right. And that's reasonable, right? You know, if you promise me $20 for something that's really only worth $10, well, maybe you really were trying to help me out. Maybe, I don't know, people do that. They'll pay someone, you know, You'll buy lemonade from a kid at a stand for $1 that was just some Kool-Aid, but it's because you want to make the kid feel happy and encourage them in their entrepreneurial spirit or whatever. I love buying lemonade from lemonade stands because they're always so excited. Like they're waiting there by the road and like you slow down and they're like, oh, and you get out of your car and you're like, how much is it? And it's like 50 cents. And you buy one and then you like give them $1 and they're like, how often can $1 bring that much joy to anybody? Right? I love it. When little kids are trying to be entrepreneurs, man, I want to support that. Like if I just give $1 to someone on the street, they'll be like, oh, great, $1, thanks. But like a kid, it was like you gave them the world. All right. All right. That's like my wife has this thing where like and so I've stolen it from her because it's a cool thing. She'll check out at the grocery store and she'll buy a candy bar and then she'll pay for the candy bar and then she'll hand it to the cashier and the cashier will be like, what? It's for you. Why? Why would you do that? I like candy bars. I figured you like candy bars. They like hold it to their breast. And I'm like, for 80 cents? You can't bring that much joy for 80 cents in any other way. I challenge you. It's a little scary, actually, to do that because you know how they're going to receive it. But, like, come on. For 80 cents, you made someone's whole day happy? It was like your guys' rocks you were talking about. You found a rock that said, like, you're awesome. And you were like, I'm awesome. Yes, I am. Right? Like, try to think of little cheap ways to I think that multiplies the value of the money in a sense. You brought joy for 80 cents. Usually you can't do anything for 80 cents, right? Anyway, candy bar. My wife will be like, I'm thinking to get a candy bar. What's your favorite candy bar? Oh, I really like this kind. So she'll buy it. She'll buy 2 of them, and then she'll give one to them, and they're just like, my mother never bought me a candy bar. All right. This is being recorded, so that was probably weird. Enforceability. So this is the degree to which a contract is binding. So contracts are either binding, meaning all parties are bound to complete the contract, as it sounds, or they're voidable. Voidable means they may become unenforceable by one party. So when you make a contract with a minor, it's voidable. And what that means is the minor can hold you to the contract, but you can't hold the minor to the contract. They have the power, right? One time my kid was at some sort of NAU choir festival or something. What's that called? Jazz Mad or something like that. He was up at that, and these guys were trying to get him to buy pictures. And so he did because he didn't want to look like he was cheap in front of his friends who were buying pictures, but he didn't want the picture. Or he didn't care if he got it. And so I guess you fill out a little thing and then they send you a payment slip at home. And I'm like, he didn't talk to me about it. I didn't know. And I was like, what's this? And everybody was like, I don't know. I'm not paying it. I don't have any picture to, so it was and they tried a couple times and then they just stopped trying to get payment because they'd made a contract with a minor and they couldn't enforce it. I found out later, oh, we actually did get a picture. We should have paid for that. It was kind of, while they couldn't enforce it, it would be wrong of me to not pay for something we got. But that was sort of a case study in that. So if you make a contract with a minor or somebody who lacks capacity, it's voidable. You could be held to it even though they can't be held to it. And then an unenforceable contract is a contract which the law actually won't allow you to enforce, such as a contract to do something illegal. That's unenforceable. Okay? So there's a slight differentiation between voidable, one side's allowed to get out of it, the other one can't, and unenforceable, nobody can be held to it because it's not legal. And then finally, the degree of completion. So there's executory, usually is how they'll say it, meaning none of the promises of the contract have been fulfilled yet. So if we both agree to something but have not yet fulfilled our parts, either side, that's executory. I can say it, I promise. There's a partially executed where one side has fulfilled their part, is now waiting for the other side to fulfill theirs. And this is in the normal course of a contract, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And then there's an executed contract, meaning it's been carried out fully by all parties. So if you think about this, they call this the taxonomy. A contract can be let's just say it could be an express contract that is bilateral, that is voidable, that is partially executed. It could be, you start to see there's many options for what a contract can be. Okay, so that's how they spell them out. And that is it for this chapter. This book has like a bunch of chapters on contracts. We could spend the rest of the course, but we're not. I think it's enough to just introduce the concept of contracts to you. If you decide you're going to become an attorney, fun. Or if you decide you're going to go into some other business that really is heavily involved in contract usage, then you'll probably learn more about contracts. Have a great weekend, and well, have a great weekend.